I fired my janitor for being late, then found out why he was crying. The fluorescent lights of the office hummed, a dull, insistent drone that usually faded into the background of my busy life. But tonight, it felt like a physical weight pressing down, amplifying the gnawing emptiness in my gut. Rain lashed against the panoramic window of my corner office, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the silence that had descended since the meeting. His name was Arthur. Arthur, the janitor. A man I'd barely registered beyond the quiet swoosh of his mop, the faint scent of disinfectant, the rhythmic click of his cart. He was a fixture, as much a part of the building's infrastructure as the ventilation system. And I had fired him. It had been a Tuesday, a particularly brutal Tuesday. Deadlines loomed, emails piled up like digital snowdrifts, and my phone had been a relentless siren call. Arthur was late. Again. Not by minutes, but by nearly an hour. The cleaning crew was small, and his tardiness threw the entire schedule into disarray. My already frayed nerves snapped. I'd stormed out of my office, the polished wood floor cool beneath my dress shoes, and marched towards the service corridor where he usually started his shift. I found him there, slumped against a stack of industrial cleaning supplies, his shoulders shaking. He was crying. Not a quiet sniffle, but a deep, ragged sobbing that tore at the sterile air. My initial reaction, fueled by the day's relentless pressure, was not sympathy, but a cold, hard surge of frustration. "Arthur," I'd said, my voice sharper than I intended, cutting through his distress. "What is going on? You're almost an hour late. This is unacceptable." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen, a look of utter despair etched onto his face. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, a choked sound that was more pain than words. I didn't wait. The deadlines, the demands, the sheer inconvenience of his emotional breakdown in my workspace, it all coalesced into a singular, overwhelming annoyance. "I can't deal with this right now, Arthur," I'd continued, my voice hardening. "This is the last straw. I'm letting you go." The words, once spoken, hung in the air, heavy and final. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a dawning comprehension, a profound hurt, before he simply nodded. A slow, defeated movement. He pushed himself off the wall, his gait unsteady, and shuffled away, leaving me standing there, the echo of his sobs still in my ears, the rain still beating against the glass. I'd returned to my office, a knot of self-righteous irritation still churning within me. I justified it to myself, of course. He was late, he was unreliable. In my world, efficiency and punctuality were paramount. Personal problems, whatever they were, didn't excuse professional shortcomings. It was a simple equation, a clear-cut decision. I'd even felt a sliver of relief, a sense of having dealt with a problem. But as the hours ticked by and the adrenaline of my outburst faded, a different feeling began to creep in. A hollowness. The silence of the office felt different now, heavier, tinged with an unspoken accusation. The rain outside seemed to mock my earlier impatience, its relentless rhythm a stark contrast to the stillness Arthur had left behind. I found myself replaying the scene, his shaking shoulders, the raw anguish on his face. I'd seen pain before, of course, but I'd always compartmentalized it, filed it away as someone else's burden. This time it felt different. It felt personal. It was the beginning of a slow, uncomfortable unraveling, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of my own self-assurance. The polished surface of my world had cracked, and through the fissure I glimpsed a landscape of human vulnerability I had meticulously avoided. The next morning, the office was unnervingly quiet, without Arthur's familiar presence. The usual faint scent of lemon polish was replaced by the stale, recycled air of a building left unattended. My coffee tasted bitter. My carefully crafted to-do list felt meaningless. I kept glancing towards the service corridor, half expecting him to reappear. A silent apology on his lips, a promise of renewed punctuality. but the corridor remained empty, a stark reminder of the finality of my decision. The weight in my stomach intensified, morphing from irritation into a dull ache. I tried to focus on work, on the spreadsheets and reports that usually consumed my attention, but my mind kept drifting. I saw Arthur's face, not just his tears, but the way his hands had trembled as he clutched a worn-out rag. I remembered the few times we'd crossed paths, his quiet nod, the respectful distance he always maintained. He was a ghost in my meticulously organized corporate machine, a ghost I had carelessly exorcised. My mind, usually so adept at problem-solving and strategic thinking, felt like a tangled mess of unanswered questions. Why was he crying? What was so important that it made him so late, so distraught? My earlier conviction, my righteous certainty began to crumble, replaced by a gnawing unease. I had acted, I realized, with a sickening lurch, not out of necessity, but out of impatience, out of a profound lack of empathy. I had judged a man based on a single transgression, a single moment of weakness, without any understanding of the forces that might have driven it. The efficiency I so prized had blinded me to the humanity I had so readily dismissed. The rain had stopped by late afternoon, leaving behind a washed, clean world that felt alien and unsettling. The sky was a bruised purple, and a weak sun struggled to break through the clouds. I found myself pacing my office, the polished floor no longer a symbol of my success, but a stage for my mounting discomfort. I couldn't shake the image of Arthur, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated pain. It was a raw, visceral image that had burrowed under my skin, refusing to be ignored. I'd made a decision based on a surface-level observation, a convenient narrative of unreliability. But what if there was more? What if his lateness wasn't a choice, but a symptom of something far deeper, something that had brought him to the brink of despair in that sterile service corridor? The thought was a cold shock, a stark confrontation with my own callousness. I had prided myself on being a decisive leader, someone who could make tough calls without flinching, but now that decisiveness felt like a cruel, unthinking, blunt instrument. I had wielded it without understanding, without compassion, and the consequences were a heavy, suffocating burden. I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that I hadn't just fired an employee. I had dismissed a human being, his struggles and his pain rendered invisible by my own narrow perspective. The hum of the office lights, once a comforting backdrop, now sounded like a mournful dirge, a soundtrack to my own moral failing. Driven by an impulse I couldn't quite articulate, a desperate need to assuage the growing unease, I grabbed my coat. I walked out of my office, the glass door sliding shut behind me with a soft hiss, and headed not for the exit, but for the building's rear entrance, the one usually reserved for deliveries and staff. The air in the service corridors was cooler, tinged with the lingering scent of cleaning fluids, and something else, something indefinable, a residue of human presence. I found myself walking towards Arthur's usual starting point, my footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet hallway. The cleaning cart was gone. The corner where he'd been slumped was empty, just a scuff mark on the linoleum floor. I stood there for a long moment, the silence amplifying the thumping of my own heart. It was then that I saw him. He was sitting on the steps leading down to the loading dock, his back to me, staring out at the darkening sky. His shoulders were still, his posture defeated. He wasn't crying anymore, but the stillness radiated a profound weariness. Hesitantly, I approached, my usual confidence replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. I stopped a few feet behind him, unsure of what to say, how to even begin to bridge the chasm I had created. He didn't turn around, but I heard a soft sigh, a breath of resignation. I took a tentative step closer. "Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper, rough with a mix of shame and a desperate plea for understanding. He finally turned his head, his eyes still puffy and red, meeting mine. There was no anger there, just a deep, pervasive sadness. He looked at me, waiting. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The carefully constructed justifications, the rationalizations for my harshness, all evaporated in the face of his quiet suffering. I saw not a late employee, but a man burdened by a weight I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The rain had begun to fall again, a soft, persistent drizzle that slicked the concrete steps and misted the air. I stood there, exposed, vulnerable, the carefully constructed facade of my professional persona stripped away. The only sound was the gentle patter of the rain and the ragged rhythm of our breathing. I realized then that I had no right to judge, no right to dismiss. My world, so ordered and controlled, had collided with a reality far more complex and painful than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. He finally spoke, his voice raspy, devoid of emotion. My wife. She's real sick. Cancer. The hospital called, said it was bad. He looked down at his hands, calloused and worn. I had to go, see her, hold her hand. He paused, a tremor running through him. Didn't know how long, how much time we had left. The words landed like blows, each one shattering the comfortable illusions I had held about my own judgment, my own humanity. The lateness, the unreliability, it wasn't a professional failing. It was a symptom of a man grappling with the unthinkable, with the imminent loss of the person he loved most. My own problems, my deadlines, my office pressures suddenly seemed laughably insignificant. I saw the stark contrast between his profound grief and my petty frustrations. I had been so consumed by my own world, so blind to the suffering that existed just beyond my polished glass walls. Shame washed over me, hot and suffocating. I had fired a man who was rushing to his dying wife's side. The weight of that realization was crushing. I stood there, speechless, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, feeling utterly, profoundly inadequate. He didn't ask for his job back. He didn't demand an apology. He simply looked at me, his gaze weary but steady, and then turned back to stare at the rain-slicked concrete. The unspoken question hung in the air. What now? I finally found my voice, the words thick with a remorse I had never known. Arthur, I began, my voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I was wrong. The admission felt like a physical release, a loosening of the tight knot of self-recrimination that had been strangling me. I saw him flinch slightly at my words, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes, but he didn't interrupt. I continued, the confession spilling out of me, raw and unvarnished. I was so caught up in my own stress, my own deadlines, that I didn't see you. I didn't see her. I just saw a problem. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and stinging. There's no excuse for how I treated you. None. I extended my hand, a simple gesture, yet it felt monumental. Your job is yours, Arthur, whenever you're ready. And if there's anything at all I can do. He looked at my outstretched hand, then back at my face, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then slowly, tentatively, he reached out and clasped my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm, a testament to a resilience I had failed to recognize. His touch, rough and work-worn, sent a jolt through me. It wasn't just a handshake. It was an acknowledgement, a fragile bridge being built over the wreckage of my insensitivity. He didn't say anything, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture, a slight easing of the tension that had seemed to hold him captive. He looked out at the rain again, a distant look in his eyes. But it was no longer the vacant stare of despair. There was a hint of something else there now, a flicker of hope perhaps, or simply a quiet acceptance. I knew in that moment that the conversation was over, that no amount of words could fully erase the hurt I had caused. But the act of acknowledging my fault, of offering genuine remorse, had shifted something fundamental within me. I had seen beyond the surface, beyond the convenient labels, and glimpsed the profound, often painful tapestry of another human life. The sterile service corridor, once a place of impersonal transactions, had become a sanctuary of unexpected revelation. I left Arthur there, standing on the loading dock steps, the rain a gentle curtain around him. As I walked back towards the brightly lit, sterile expanse of my office, the world felt different. The fluorescent lights seemed less oppressive, the hum of the building less like a drone and more like a quiet pulse. The rain had washed the city clean, and in its wake it had washed something clean within me too. The weight in my stomach had lifted, replaced by a quiet ache of understanding. I hadn't solved Arthur's problems, but I had recognized them, acknowledged them, and in doing so I had begun to mend a small part of the damage I had inflicted. My own world, once so sharply defined by success and efficiency, now felt broader, more complex, and infinitely more human. The polished floor of my office no longer represented an unassailable peak, but a surface that could and should be marked by the passage of real life. The memory of his tears, once a source of discomfort, now served as a constant reminder. It was a quiet hum beneath the surface of my daily life, a gentle, persistent nudge towards a deeper awareness. I found myself looking at people differently, seeing the stories etched in their faces, the quiet battles they might be fighting behind closed doors. The urge to judge, to dismiss, to label based on fleeting impressions had been tempered by the raw, undeniable reality of Arthur's pain. My own stress, my own deadlines still existed, but they no longer felt like the center of the universe. They were simply threads in a much larger, more intricate weave. I had learned that true strength wasn't in the ability to make harsh decisions, but in the capacity to understand, to empathize, and to offer grace, especially when it was hardest to do so. The clean, silent office was no longer a sanctuary from the messy world, but a space where I was learning to live more fully within it. The rain had washed away the grime, and in its place, a fragile understanding bloomed. I saw a man, not a problem. And in that seeing, I began to see myself. The weight of Arthur's quiet suffering had settled within me, not as a burden, but as a recalibration. It wasn't just about his wife's illness. It was about the inherent blindness that comes with privilege, the way comfort can insulate us from the raw, messy realities of others' lives. My own professional world, once a fortress of controlled variables and predictable outcomes, now felt porous, exposed to the unpredictable currents of human experience. I started noticing the small things, the hurried breath of the intern rushing to a meeting, the subtle slump of shoulders on the late-night IT technician, the fleeting look of worry on a colleague's face as they answered a personal call. These weren't just background details anymore. They were potential narratives, stories of burdens carried unseen. This newfound awareness wasn't a conscious decision, but an emergent property of a cracked perspective. It was like learning to see in a different spectrum of light, where the previously invisible became starkly apparent. Furthermore, this shift began to reshape my interactions, not through grand pronouncements, but through subtle adjustments in my approach. Instead of immediately zeroing in on a missed deadline, my first instinct became a quiet observation. Was there a tremor in their hand as they held their coffee cup? Was their gaze drifting, unfocused, lost in thoughts, far removed from the quarterly report? This wasn't about excusing poor performance, but about understanding its roots. It was about recognizing that behind every professional output, there was a person navigating a complex inner landscape, a landscape often fraught with challenges I couldn't possibly fathom. Consequently, my questions began to shift from accusatory to inquisitive, from demanding explanations to offering support. "Is everything all right?" became a more frequent and more genuine preamble to discussions about performance. Building on this, however, the true test lay not in these initial moments of heightened sensitivity, but in the sustained effort to integrate this empathy into the fabric of my daily operations. It meant actively seeking out opportunities to offer grace, to extend a benefit of the doubt that wasn't rooted in a desire for efficiency, but in a fundamental respect for individual humanity. For instance, when a project timeline began to slip due to unforeseen personal circumstances for a team member, my initial impulse to recalculate resource allocation and pressure for faster turnaround was replaced by a quieter, more deliberate conversation. It involved understanding the nature of the obstacle, exploring realistic adjustments, and communicating a clear expectation of continued effort once the immediate crisis had passed, without making the individual feel like a pariah. Conversely, this evolving perspective also illuminated the subtle ways my previous demeanor had inadvertently fostered an environment of fear rather than collaboration. The drive for perfection, the intolerance for error, had created a culture where mistakes were hidden, where genuine struggles were masked, and where vulnerability was seen as a liability. Arthur's quiet tears had been a symptom of a system that punished, rather than supported, human frailty. Now I recognize the importance of fostering psychological safety, of creating a space where individuals felt empowered to admit when they were struggling, knowing that the response would be one of understanding and problem-solving, not condemnation. This required a conscious dismantling of my own ingrained habits, a deliberate unlearning of the rigid results-obsessed mindset that had previously defined my leadership. Another crucial layer is the profound realization that empathy is not a passive emotion, but an active practice. It demands a willingness to step outside one's own frame of reference, to actively listen not just to the words being spoken, but to the unspoken emotions underlying them. It means resisting the urge to project one's own experiences or assumptions onto another person's situation. Consider, for example, the difference between seeing a colleague's extended absence as an inconvenience to be managed and understanding it as a period of intense personal trial that requires patience and accommodation. This active engagement requires a constant, conscious effort to remain open, to remain curious, and to remain fundamentally human in interactions that can often become depersonalized by the demands of the professional world. It's about choosing to see the whole person, not just their role. The profound shift in perspective wasn't merely about recognizing suffering. It was about understanding the insidious ways my own previous worldview had actively hindered genuine connection. My relentless pursuit of efficiency had, in effect, created a sterile transactional environment where human nuances were deemed inconvenient variables. Now I saw that true leadership wasn't about optimizing processes, but about cultivating a fertile ground for human flourishing, even amidst professional demands. This involved a conscious re-evaluation of how I communicated expectations. Instead of issuing directives that assumed unwavering competence, I began framing requests with an implicit acknowledgement of potential challenges, inviting a dialogue about feasibility rather than demanding compliance. For instance, when assigning a complex project, my approach evolved from stating, "This needs to be done by Friday," to something more like, "Here's the objective for this project. Let's discuss the timeline and any potential roadblocks you foresee. How can we best support you in achieving this?" This transition also brought into sharp focus the critical distinction between performance management and personal judgment. Previously, my approach had blurred these lines, conflating a missed deadline with a character flaw. Now I understood the imperative to separate the two, evaluating an employee's output and professional conduct objectively, while simultaneously holding a deep respect for their personal circumstances. This meant developing a more nuanced framework for addressing underperformance. Instead of immediate disciplinary action, the process now began with an open conversation aimed at diagnosing the root cause. Was it a skill deficit that required training? Was it a lack of resources that needed to be addressed? Or was it, as in Arthur's case, a deeply personal issue impacting their capacity to perform? Addressing the actual problem, rather than merely the symptom, became the new guiding principle. Furthermore, this evolved understanding necessitated a proactive approach to fostering resilience within the team. It wasn't enough to react with empathy when a crisis struck. The goal became to build an environment where individuals felt secure enough to navigate challenges without fear of reprisal. This translated into practical measures, such as implementing more flexible work arrangements where feasible, promoting open communication channels for sharing concerns, and actively destigmatizing conversations around mental health and personal well-being. Consider, for example, the impact of offering a designated quiet space within the office, or establishing clear protocols for emergency leave that didn't require lengthy justifications. These were not acts of charity, but strategic investments in the long-term health and productivity of the workforce, recognizing that a supported employee is a more engaged and effective employee. Conversely, the temptation to revert to old habits, to fall back on the familiar comfort of rigid control and immediate judgment, remained a constant internal battle. The ingrained patterns of a performance-driven culture were not easily dismantled. This meant that moments of self-awareness were crucial. When I caught myself falling into a judgmental thought pattern or reacting with impatience to a perceived inefficiency, I learned to pause, to consciously acknowledge the impulse, and then to redirect my focus towards understanding and support. And this internal recalibration was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the transformation, requiring a sustained commitment to self-reflection and a willingness to admit when my own ingrained biases were resurfacing. It was a continuous process of learning and adjustment rather than a singular moment of enlightenment. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where a team member consistently misses internal deadlines, not for external reasons, but seemingly due to disorganization. Instead of immediately issuing a warning, a more effective approach, informed by this evolved perspective, would be to initiate a conversation focused on understanding their workflow. Perhaps they are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tasks, or they lack a structured system for prioritizing. The goal isn't to excuse the missed deadlines, but to collaboratively identify the underlying issues and implement strategies for improvement, such as time management training or a revised task delegation system. This approach transforms a potential disciplinary issue into a coaching opportunity, fostering growth and reinforcing trust, rather than simply enforcing compliance. This commitment to seeing the individual, not just the task, is the bedrock of genuine ethical awakening. The ingrained tendency to view professional shortcomings through a lens of personal failing required a more active dismantling than I initially anticipated. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge Arthur's situation. I had to confront the deeply embedded biases that led me to judge him so harshly in the first place. This meant actively seeking out situations where my initial instinctual assessment might be skewed by preconceived notions. For instance, when a junior team member struggled with client presentations, my first thought might have been about their lack of confidence or preparation. However, now, I would pause and consider other possibilities. Were they perhaps dealing with a communication barrier I hadn't recognized? Were they receiving adequate coaching from their direct supervisor? Or was there an underlying anxiety disorder at play that made public speaking a genuine ordeal? This shift from assuming a character deficit to investigating systemic or situational factors demanded a more complex, investigative approach to management. Furthermore, fostering an environment where vulnerability wasn't perceived as weakness necessitated a deliberate reconstruction of how feedback was delivered and received. Instead of the stark, often demoralizing, performance review format that focused solely on deficits, I began implementing more regular informal check-ins. These sessions were designed to be collaborative dialogues, where the employee's self-assessment was given equal weight to my observations. The focus shifted from identifying what was wrong to collaboratively identifying areas for growth and development. This meant asking questions like, what aspects of this project felt most challenging for you? Or, what support do you feel would be most beneficial for your professional development moving forward? This approach aimed to empower individuals, making them active participants in their own improvement, rather than passive recipients of critique. Consequently, this recalibration extended to how organizational policies were perceived and applied. Rigid adherence to rules, while sometimes necessary, could also create undue hardship. I started to recognize the importance of discretionary flexibility, particularly in circumstances where a strict interpretation of a policy might exacerbate an employee's personal difficulties. For example, a policy requiring all employees to be physically present during core business hours might inadvertently penalize a single parent struggling with childcare arrangements. In such cases, exploring options like adjusted start times or a hybrid work model, even if not formally codified, demonstrated a commitment to individual circumstances that transcended mere rule following. This wasn't about bending rules arbitrarily, but about applying them with a humanistic understanding. Conversely, the challenge lay in ensuring that this newfound empathy did not inadvertently lead to a dilution of accountability. The goal was not to create an environment where poor performance was tolerated, but to ensure that performance issues were addressed with a foundation of understanding and support. This meant maintaining clear expectations regarding outcomes and responsibilities, while simultaneously being open to exploring the underlying reasons for any shortcomings. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant vigilance to ensure that compassion did not devolve into permissiveness. For instance, when addressing a recurring issue with missed deadlines, the conversation would focus on identifying the specific obstacles and co-creating a concrete action plan with measurable steps, rather than simply accepting vague assurances of future improvement. Another crucial layer involved recognizing that my own past actions, like the dismissal of Arthur, had likely contributed to a culture where employees felt hesitant to disclose personal struggles. The fear of judgment or reprecipitation was a tangible barrier. Therefore, actively working to demonstrate a commitment to support became paramount. This involved not just verbal assurances, but tangible actions. When a team member needed to take unexpected leave for a family emergency, ensuring their workload was redistributed efficiently and without undue burden on them, and proactively communicating that their position was secure, sent a powerful message. It was about creating a visible, consistent pattern of supportive behavior that gradually eroded the existing culture of apprehension and built trust from the ground up. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where a team member consistently underperforms on tasks requiring meticulous attention to detail, and your initial reaction is to assume a lack of diligence. Instead of immediately questioning their work ethic, a more nuanced approach would involve exploring potential underlying causes. Are they struggling with a vision impairment that makes fine print difficult to read? Have they been provided with adequate magnification tools or specialized software? Or perhaps the task itself is poorly defined, lacking the clear parameters necessary for precision. The focus shifts from assigning blame to diagnosing the root cause, thereby enabling a targeted and supportive solution that addresses the actual obstacle to their performance. This journey of ethical awakening is not a destination, but a continuous unfolding. The past, once a source of regret, now serves as a compass. I find myself listening more, judging less, and seeing the world not as a series of tasks to be managed, but as a tapestry woven with individual human experiences. Reflecting on this journey so far, it becomes evident that the initial encounter, seemingly small and easily dismissed, acted as a potent catalyst, unraveling deeply ingrained assumptions. The subsequent ripple effects, far from being isolated incidents, revealed a pervasive interconnectedness between individual actions and the broader human landscape. It's akin to a single stone dropped into a vast, still lake. The initial splash is localized, but the ensuing ripples expand, subtly altering the surface tension and creating patterns that extend far beyond the point of impact. The sterile efficiency that once defined my operational compass now appears as a necessary, yet ultimately insufficient framework, incapable of encompassing the full spectrum of human experience. The pursuit of order, once paramount, has yielded to an appreciation for the inherent complexities and often unpredictable currents that shape individual lives. As we pivot towards the final reflection, the convergence of these explored ideas suggests a fundamental recalibration of perspective. The emphasis has shifted from the mechanics of performance to the underlying humanity that drives it. The challenges encountered, initially perceived as obstacles to progress, have instead illuminated pathways toward a more profound understanding of connection and responsibility. It's as if the very act of looking closer, of pausing to truly see, has begun to re-etch the contours of reality, revealing a richer, more nuanced terrain than previously perceived. The echoes of past decisions, once sharp and accusatory, now resonate with a quieter, more instructive tone, guiding the way forward. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes clearer, not as a predefined route, but as a continuous process of engagement and discovery. The initial judgment, so swift and seemingly justified, now serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of context and compassion. The consequences that followed, initially felt as personal discomfort, have blossomed into a broader recognition of shared vulnerability. The narrative has moved from a singular event to a testament to the transformative power of acknowledging the unseen dimensions of another's existence. The focus has irrevocably shifted from the transactional to the relational, from the superficial to the deeply resonant. This journey, sparked by a single, seemingly insignificant moment of perceived unreliability, has unfolded not as a series of discrete events, but as a continuous unraveling of deeply ingrained assumptions. The initial judgment, swift and absolute, served as the first tremor that cracked the facade of my self-assuredness. What followed was not a simple correction, but a profound recalibration of how I perceive and interact with the world. It's the realization that behind every action, every perceived failing, lies a narrative far richer and more complex than a quick assessment can ever reveal. The sterile pursuit of order has given way to an appreciation for the inherent, often beautiful chaos of human existence, and the understanding that true strength lies not in control, but in compassion. The true practice begins now. It is in the daily choices, the subtle shifts in how we listen, how we respond, how we choose to see. It is in recognizing that empathy is not a passive state, but an active, ongoing commitment to understanding the unseen struggles of others, to extending grace not as a concession, but as a fundamental aspect of our shared humanity. The echoes of Arthur's quiet pain serve not as a burden of guilt, but as a guiding light, illuminating the path toward a more authentic and connected existence. The world, once viewed through the narrow lens of personal ambition, now reveals itself in its full, intricate glory, demanding not just our attention, but our deepest understanding and our most genuine